Hey there, and thanks for joining me for another creative session. To those who are unfamiliar, my name is Christi du Toit, and I'm a South African freelance illustrator and multidisciplinary designer. In my last video, I ran through my typical illustration process, but this time I'll be working in Affinity Photo, and I'm excited to talk a bit more about the latest digital brush pack I've been working on, which is currently available in the Affinity Store. The brush pack is called ARTECHNIKA, and while it's pretty versatile, it's really aimed at creating more technical drawings and sketches, such as this little spider mech we'll be drawing today. I often start getting my ideas out on paper initially, but the brush pack still provides a variety of sketching tools should you choose to go with a fully digital workflow. I used Affinity Designer a lot in the past, but I found myself gravitating more towards photo recently, as most of my work isn't created in a vector format, and I found that photo just gives me a bit of a wider selection of pixel-based tools to choose and use. With that in mind, you can absolutely use these brushes and assets in whichever Affinity app you prefer. This is just my personal preference and by no means a prerequisite. I do feel it's important to note that I'm using a drawing tablet with pressure sensitivity to help me draw more freely in a digital format. While it's not technically a necessity, I highly recommend a tablet for any digital artist working in the current day and age. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. ARTECHNIKA comes with a bunch of different types of drawing tools and assets, as well as a few extras such as paper textures, macros, and even a custom font. Now, I'm not in the business of stifling people's creativity and really encourage anyone using these tools to experiment and see what works for them. For me personally, I find certain combinations of tools to produce particularly visually appealing results, not unlike how certain fonts work together and suit certain designs, or how some colors work well together. Happy accidents do happen though, so it's important to get to know the nuances of the tools that you're using so that you can make educated decisions on which might be good choices for your projects. For the spider mech illustration, we'll be using a combination of the clutch pencil, which I initially used to refine my scan sketch, the ballpoint pen for inking up the thin lines and rendering, the permanent marker for thick outlines, the watercolor brush for coloring and shading, and the ink splatter and noise brushes for some visual texture. I'll touch on these a bit more as we work our way through the illustration though. On screen, you can see a few experiments combining different tools to create a variety of looks. What I've found is that more than the final aesthetic, what really differentiates the brushes for me is the way that they feel when drawing, and that ultimately bleeds through into the style that I draw in. Some of the tools might seem a bit simple, but I've gone to great lengths to try and achieve the most natural brush feel for them, even when working with a digital stylus. The dry felt liner feels like a dry micron. The fountain pen feels nice and lush like a real fountain pen. The manga pen is stiff yet flexible like a G pen, and so on. With my sketch lightened on a separate layer, I'm using the ballpoint pen to meticulously ink over it, working out the kinks as I go along. I kind of think of this first phase of inking almost like a refined sketch in a way, because I'm going over my initial rough sketch and just kind of cleaning things up. I like the ballpoint pen for this step because with varying hand pressure, you can create thinner or lighter lines to sketch out some of the construction lines in the drawing without them being too prominent, or at least prominent enough to impact the final piece. As the project goes along, they just sort of fade into the rest of the illustration, but in the moment, they're a practical guide. Other brushes I might recommend for this step would be really any of the pencils, especially the clutch or mechanical pencil, the rapido pen, the dry felt liner, or anything that can produce lighter, thinner, or more subtle lines that you can beef up later on to create some more line weight variation. I've used the newsprint paper texture, which you can access either in the brush pack's download folder or directly in the app from the ARTECHNIKA assets. I like eliminating the dreaded blank canvas as early as possible, as it can tend to be quite daunting to look at. Adding a texture from the start also adds a sense of finality to the work, even when it's in the early stages, which just takes a bit of the pressure away. To anyone who follows my work, it probably won't come as a surprise that I tend to obsess over the inking phase and actually spend more time here than on any other phase in the whole project. I definitely spend more time than I should on this step, and for that reason, you may notice that I'm adding a very slight but intentional wobble to my lines, which is something I've been doing more recently, and I've sort of nicked from watching architects and urban sketchers draw. This deliberate imperfection helps me to stop trying to make things too clean and subsequently slow and tedious from the get-go, as I've done in the past, and to rather focus on progressing through the project. This isn't a vector illustration after all, so why not lean into that and keep things a bit more loose and spontaneous? The artwork can always be cleaned up further later on if you choose to do that, but the wobbly line actually ends up adding a really honest charm and a warm characteristic to the final work, which is a nice bonus. So trust the process, as they say. Something else that you may notice is that I've overlapped some of the intersecting lines, which creates very defined visual corners. This is a technique that's commonplace in technical sketches. I've also focused on incorporating a lot of straight lines, S-curves, and C-curve strokes, which I find immediately adds more of a draftsman-esque look and feel. This may or may not be something that you like, so just have fun with it and go with what feels best. To help the illustration pop off the page, I've outlined it using the permanent marker, which produces a solid, dark line with some subtle texture. Other brushes you might find useful for this outlining task could be the clutch pencil with a heavy hand if you like more of a penciled and sketchy look, the brush pen if you'd like more of a varied line weight or comic bookish look, or you can even increase the brush size of some of the smaller brushes to see if there's any merit in using them for a different purpose. Experimentation is key. The use of line weight in artwork and design drawing is actually a pretty loaded topic, and there are a number of approaches. Fortunately, there are numerous written lessons and video tutorials online on this topic if it's something you'd like to delve into more. Moving on to the rendering, I've actually decided to switch back to the ballpoint pen as I construct the shadow shapes to better convey where the light sources of the work are. Similar to how I used the ballpoint pen to construct certain elements earlier in the inking stage, I've decided to go with two light sources, a strong key light at the top left, as well as a secondary ambient light source towards the bottom right, as indicated by the two little arrows that I've included. This may not be super apparent in the inking stage and will really be something that comes together more while painting the highlights and shading, but it's good to keep in mind so that the dark inked shadows follow the same premise. It also allows me to leave open spaces that I know will be lit later down the line. Working on the shadows is always a really fun process for me. I almost treat them as clay that you can mold and add depth and actively design to better explain the elements they occupy. The way you treat this can also inject a lot of style into your work. Some people may opt to exclude black shadows altogether. Others might prefer something more subtle or more textured and or painterly. This is really dictated by your style and preference, but I find it to be quite a fascinating topic. For the rendering, I've used a series of light hatched strokes. I keep them quite tightly spaced to create the illusion of a mid-tone and almost give them a textural sort of quality. I'm also using the pressure sensitivity of the brush to fade and taper them. Something I didn't initially plan but ended up doing anyway was to use the ballpoint to create my fills. What I liked about it was that the fills were not completely blacked out and you could see a bit of the paper coming through. This was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I felt that it added a bit more of a sketchy and natural characteristic and texture to the shadows. It's definitely more time consuming doing it this way, as you could otherwise have used more time effective methods to create the black fills such as selection tools or the flood fill tool, but since this illustration is fairly straightforward in that it's an isolated design as opposed to a scene with characters interacting with an environment, I decided it would be worth putting in a few extra minutes to ultimately add more character to the overall piece. As much fun as I have working on the inked shadows, I also have to remind myself not to get too carried away. If I add too many, then I run the risk of making the work look illegible or muddy, so it's important to try and strike a balance between light and shadow. Visual contrast is such an important aspect to consider in just about every step along the way, and the darkest shadows are obviously no exception to this, and rather one of the most prominent places where you can actually control this. To end things off, I've gone back in with some textural noise and splatter brushes to add some subtle effects that just add that little something extra to round things out as we prepare for the coloring phase. Now, I'm not going to let you sit through the whole flatting section, as it can be a bit lengthy and pretty mind-numbing to watch, so for the sake of time, I've sped that up quite a bit. All you need to know is that I used a combination of the flatter brush, which utilizes the pencil tool, which has a very defined hard edge, as well as the freehand selection tool to fill in some base colors underneath the inks layer. I've unchecked anti-aliasing for the selection tool so that I can easily create seamless selections using the flood selection tool, which will come in handy for the next phase. I've stuck with a limited color palette of pinkish hues and desaturated grayish purples to create a harmonious range of colors that all play well together. I was quite inspired by the Tachikoma from Ghost in the Shell for the way I've approached the colors, and really for the concept as a whole for this mech. Slowing things down again, something I did do with the flat colors that's probably worth mentioning now is that I've created a separate layer and used the flats as a selection guide rather than having them be an actual direct part of the work. The way I've handled this was to use the flood selection tool to batch select color ranges from the flats layer, and then on a new layer to use the watercolor brush to repaint the flats. I love the watercolor aesthetic, and especially how nicely and unexpectedly it contrasts with something more visually harsh like technical line work, so I wanted to retain that in the flat colors as well as the shading so that there's more of a cohesive look to the final piece. The final result is a slightly washed out and more natural looking base layer to work on, which has a lot more texture and character than just having a set of completely opaque flats. Depending on your background color choice, you could also use this as an opportunity to do a glaze to tie some of the colors together, which is something traditional watercolor artists might do, but we're going to skip that step for now as I have a different plan for the background. As a last step, I've used the messy chisel to fill the rectangle behind the mech to add additional texture and draw a bit more attention to the mech's head as the focal point of the artwork. Moving on to the shading, I started by sketching and designing some of the shaded areas first, which is similar to what I did initially with the black shadows. I sometimes find that adding these little planning steps in between just stops me from having to go through a bunch of trial and error and back and forth during the process, and to rather focus on starting with a solid game plan to make sure I keep things moving in the right direction. I've also hidden the base color layer for the moment, as it's a bit easier to see what I'm doing, but I'll be bringing them back as soon as I finish the shading. For the shadows themselves, I've used the watercolor brush to paint them in. By default, the watercolor brush's blending mode is set to multiply, and you can certainly use it that way, as it's the way that I originally intended for it to be used and how traditional watercolor would act. That being said, working like that would result in every overlapping stroke being darker and richer, which is great if you're after that, but it also means that you should avoid lifting your brush while painting shapes, as doing so would essentially bake the look into the stroke. Since I often work with clients who need changes made to the work, I instinctively try and keep things as non-destructive as possible throughout the process. Because of this, I decided to rather do that manually and set the brush back to the normal blending mode. That gives me a bit more control and allows me to create two separate shadow passes that I can use to better manage how the mech is being lit by the light source. You may notice that I've also ignored the key light for the time being, and this is because I plan to add a few effects to that in the highlights phase instead. The key light is the primary light source after all, and I want to ensure that it really stands out as the brightest part of the illustration. The act of shading involves darkening areas, so I'm focusing on that mostly for now and using the ambient light I mentioned earlier on as my guide to do so. Something good to keep in mind here is how to create an illusion of three-dimensionality in an otherwise two-dimensional drawing. I try and think of each shape that I'm shading as existing in the real world somehow and how it would interact with the light source. Realism obviously isn't the goal here, of course, but believability is. Pillow shading is a term often used in pixel art and describes the act of only shading the edges of the shapes, creating a pillow-like or cardboard cutout sort of effect, resulting in the work appearing flat and pretty unconvincing. This is obviously mostly undesirable, and the key is to allow yourself to be a bit bolder with the amount of shadows that you include. Remember, not every part of the artwork is important, so it's okay to have some sections be completely in shadow. This will also help you to establish a visual hierarchy, which you can use to help lead the viewer's eye to the focal elements. This is a really subtle but very powerful tool that artists can use, so make sure that you don't skip over it. As we start to reach the end of the shading phase, I've turned the base color layer back on to get a better feel for how everything is working together. I'm taking this opportunity to refine certain areas of my shading and also to use the blending marker included in the ARTECHNIKA pack to fade out a few of the softer edges to help better describe some of the forms. Adding highlights is such a great step, as with every bit added you can really start to see the artwork becoming more finalized. Some people start with the highlights, but I like keeping this as a last step as it's always nice to approach it as the icing on the cake. It's also one of the last opportunities to add a very meaningful element to the work other than effects and adjustments, so I find it's a nice finishing stage. The way that you incorporate the lighting can really help to describe the texture underneath it. For instance, clothing fabric might not reflect lighting as much, so in those elements it would make more sense to keep the highlights subtle. In this case though, almost everything is made from either metal or presumably a glossy paint of some kind, so the more little highlights you add, the more shiny those elements will read as. I've used the key light to create a heavy rim along the top edge of the mech. As I mentioned, this will further emphasize this as a focal area. It's a subtle implication that your eyes need to be drawn to that, and it's a tried and tested method that works every time. Because of that, I've kept the rest of the highlights fairly subtle, but still chose to include a few others throughout the illustration for the sake of cohesiveness and continuity. On the topic of cohesiveness, all of the highlights are also done with the same watercolor brush to ensure that all of the elements play well together and that nothing looks out of place. Once the highlights are done, it's time to add some finishing effects. I've added some light blooms to some of the brightest areas with the airbrush, as well as a glow to the eye of the mech. This adds a nice amount of visual appeal, but is otherwise also quite subtle. You may notice my excessive use of the word subtle at the moment. That's because these final tweaks are all about adding tiny details to polish things off. Even still, it can often be these small steps that make all the difference in the end. As we wrap this up, I've added some shadow fades, also using the airbrush to emphasize the light more, as well as some tweaks, and really ended things off with a few adjustment layers. This isn't really a crucial step, but I find that adding a few adjustment layers sometimes helps the colors and elements just gel and mesh together a bit more in the final piece. You might remember that I initially had something in mind for the background, and that idea was to use a cardboard texture as the base. The cardboard texture can also be accessed in the ARTECHNIKA assets, as with the newsprint texture earlier on. The darker cardboard is also closer to a mid-tone, so it really leads to the highlights standing out rather than fading into the light background. Since the background is darker than before, I've also added a light outline to the entire image to really help it pop off the page. For standalone illustrations or designs, this is a really easy way to make things just a little bit more impactful and also a really nice finishing step. And with that in mind, that is the last thing that I'm going to be adding to this illustration. And yeah, that's a wrap. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around to the end for this deep dive into how I would use just a few of the tools in the ARTECHNIKA content pack to create something original. Hopefully you've enjoyed watching and following along and picked up a few techniques or ideas. Should you decide to purchase ARTECHNIKA, you can do so in the official Affinity Store, and thank you so much in advance for the support. In case you'd like to stay up to date with what I'm up to, you can follow me by visiting one of the links on screen. And as always, a big thank you goes out to Seraph for having me. Happy creating.